Where do you think this footage was captured? The real answer might surprise you. You might guess this crowd is at a concert or a political rally, or even fleeing a war. But they're not. They've all gathered to say goodbye to one very surprising person, Pablo Escobar. This is actual footage from the funeral of the notorious drug lord that attracted a shockingly big crowd. But why are they all there? What actually happened at the funeral? Let's take a closer look at Pablo Escobar's send-off. In case you don't know much about Pablo Escobar, we're going to fill you in. Escobar was one of the most successful drug lords of all time as the head of the Medellin cartel in Colombia. He entered a life of crime all on his own. His dad worked as a farmer and his mum was a teacher. They were ordinary, honest, hard-working people. Escobar chose a different life. He grew up in Medellin, where he began his life of crime as a teenager. He would sell fake diplomas, smuggle stereos, and even steal gravestones to resell. His first arrest came when he was caught stealing a car. In the mid-1970s, he took advantage of the growing cocaine industry in Colombia and started the Medellin cartel. By the mid-80s, he was the head of probably the most powerful cartel in the world. It's thought that he was the man behind 80% of all cocaine sold across the entire world while he was operating. I think we can all agree that's a pretty shocking statistic. He had more power and money than most of us could dream of. Some experts estimate he was worth a mind-blowing $25 billion. That would have made him the 7th richest man in the world at the time. He earned those billions thanks to his savage reputation. Where he lived in luxury, his business policies were notoriously aggressive. If he couldn't bribe someone to get his way, he'd murder them in cold blood. He approached everyone with the same policy. It didn't matter if they were members of a rival cartel, government officials, police officers, or even civilians. He showed the world how aggressive he could be in 1989 when the Medellin cartel planted a bomb on an airplane to kill one official who he believed was an informant. Tragically, over 100 people were killed, although the man who Escobar was targeting never got on the plane. But that was just one incident. It's thought that he's responsible for the deaths of at least 4,000 people, maybe even as many as 5,000. It won't surprise you that he was one of the most wanted men in the world. US authorities were especially interested in getting their hands on him. The majority of his cocaine sales were made in the US, and he quickly became one of their top targets in the war on drugs. But he was never going to be an easy catch. A huge manhunt was set in place while the US negotiated with the Colombian government to get Escobar extradited to America. Amazingly, he eventually turned himself in, but not just to any prison. He was allowed to build his own prison, which included a waterfall, a sauna, and a nightclub. However, when he tortured and killed 2 of his fellow inmates, they decided he needed to be moved to a more ordinary prison. Just before he was due to be transferred, he escaped. The authorities decided the best way to capture him was to take custody of his family. The CIA brought them in and waited. Sure enough, they got what they wanted. The day of his 44th birthday, Escobar called his son. This meant the authorities could trace Escobar's location and move in. The very next day, his Medellin hideout was discovered and forces stormed the building. It caused a chaotic fight, and Escobar escaped to the roof with one of his bodyguards. This led to a chase and a huge gunfight. Finally, Escobar was fatally shot. The position of the bullet wound at his ear led to some conflict. Many still think that Escobar actually shot himself to avoid being apprehended by authorities. But either way, the 16-year-long reign of terror of the world's most prolific drug lord was over. Viva Colombia could be heard playing over the radio as soon as news broke. Escobar's body was moved to a morgue in Medellin. There, his family took the opportunity to gather and say goodbye. But it didn't last. They were forced to run when a sea of reporters and rival cartel members appeared at the building. They weren't only mourning a loss while the country publicly celebrated, they were also trying to deal with a lot of unwanted attention. The army and authorities were joyous about the death of this powerful criminal. But you might notice that this footage of his funeral doesn't only show joy. Why do so many people look so devastated about the death of a ruthless drug smuggler? Like most things, this story is more complicated than it appears. While the Americans and the uncorrupted segments of the Colombian government were celebrating the death of a murderer and cocaine distributor who'd caused great suffering to people all over the world, some Colombian communities were experiencing something quite different. To them, they just lost their Robin Hood. See, while Escobar was earning billions from drugs, he wasn't keeping all of it. He was actually a hero to the poorest communities in the hillside town of Medellin. He'd given millions of dollars to the community and even built an entire town perched on top of the hill so the poorest people would have somewhere to live and open new businesses of their own. Of course, this town and all the other gifts he offered to the poor wasn't just to be kind. He was, in reality, trying to secure their loyalty. See, a few $1 million wasn't worth so much to someone with billions. But a small army of followers surrounding Escobar's home was seriously valuable to him. But they didn't see it that way. To them, Escobar was a hero. He represented everything they aspired to. He'd made a decision to step out of poverty and build an empire, and he succeeded in a way that nobody could have ever predicted. After all, he did become one of the most successful people who ever lived, despite his humble beginnings. He then shared his success with the people who needed it most. To them, his story was their greatest aspiration. How he'd achieved that success didn't matter so much to the people receiving the gifts he was giving to them. That explains why people came out in huge numbers to attend the funeral of this drug lord and murderer. In no time, a crowd of about 25,000 Colombians had gathered to pay their respects. It was an outpouring of grief that grew so large, the army had to be brought in to control the giant crowd. It's said that when Escobar's own family arrived to say goodbye to their husband and father, the crowd had already grown so big that there was no space for them to open the doors of the car they arrived in. They were forced to leave without ever stepping out the vehicle. Of course, it wasn't all mourners. Some people had come out to see for themselves if the worst cartel leader who ever lived really was finally dead. Those people saw the occasion as a celebration, but there was more than enough grief to go around. The burial was rushed as authorities struggled to maintain control. In the end, the priest in attendance didn't even finish his prayers. The angry crowd was taking over, and he left. Escobar's family was ambushed by reporters on the outer edge of the crowd. While they didn't want to speak, Escobar's oldest son eventually began pleading with reporters. He described how terrible it was that he'd lost his father so violently, and how terrible the experience of the funeral was for him. He asked them to please give them the space to just make things a little bit more normal for his mum and especially his little sister. It was a heartbreaking moment, even coming from the son of a murderer. It didn't go at all to plan, but finally when the drug lord was in the ground, the crowd dispersed. Today, you can still see what remains of Escobar's wide-reaching influence in Colombia. To some, he's a dark part of the country's history, the kind of figure they want to compare to leaders like Hitler. His power had consequences in the country that are still felt, and his worldwide fame has caused other cultures to view Colombia in a more negative way than it deserves. But still, if you walk up one of the hills surrounding the city center of Medellin where Escobar lived, you'll find the town he built for the underprivileged. You'll spot it by the flag that hangs at the entrance of the town, which boldly and proudly displays Escobar's face. There's no mistaking his hero status here. Ask the locals, and they'll tell you the town is affectionately nicknamed Pablo Escobar. You'll find many shops selling flags and t-shirts with the cartel leader's face printed on them, celebrating his legacy in the region. But bump into a different person, and they'll tell you how appalling the celebrations are. There are loads of people in Colombia who lost a loved one only because Escobar ordered their execution. And many of the people that were lost weren't even involved with the cartels. To those that lived through a terrible loss like the plane bombing, Escobar is definitely a villain, and seeing his face everywhere painted as a hero is a terrible thing to have to live with. Even Escobar's own son hasn't stood by Escobar's actions. There's clearly a divide in opinion about Escobar and his legacy that dates back to before his funeral, but was most clear in the crowd that gathered at his burial. But there's one thing nobody can deny. He made an ever-present mark on the country of Colombia that will last far beyond his life. What do you think about Escobar's crimes? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more videos like this.